The cameras had barely finished rolling when the silence broke. A hush swept through the audience. The anchors struggled to keep their composure, and viewers across the globe were left frozen in disbelief. Prince William, usually the very definition of composure, poise, and royal dignity, had broken down in tears on live television. For a man raised from childhood to master control, to suppress emotion before the cameras, the sight of his tears was more than shocking. It was a rupture in the carefully guarded facade of royalty. Something catastrophic had happened behind palace walls. Something so grave that the heir to the throne could no longer contain himself. But what was it that brought William, the future King of England, to such a breaking point? What happened that could make the stoic, steady brother unravel in front of millions? The world would soon learn the cause. His younger brother, Prince Harry, had been hospitalized after a violent altercation at home. His face and head were left battered, covered in hospital bandages, sparking a tidal wave of global concern and speculation. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This was not the kind of royal scandal one could sweep under the plush carpets of Buckingham Palace. This wasn't a matter of bad press, leaked letters, or family feuds whispered through tabloids. This was physical, brutal, and visceral. The whole world saw the pictures of Harry, broken and fragile, in a hospital bed. And more haunting still, they saw William's tears, his sobs audible as he tried to speak. The introduction to this story cannot begin anywhere else but here, at the crossroads where private fury collides with public collapse, where one brother fights for his health and the other drowns in grief for the world to see. But how did things reach such a devastating climax? To answer that, we need to pull back the curtain on years of royal drama, fractured trust, and deepening divides that eventually erupted in violence. Royal watchers know the Sussexes have long lived under tension. From the moment Harry and Meghan stepped away from their royal duties in 2020, cracks in their relationships with the rest of the royal family widened. Publicly, Harry and Meghan painted themselves as victims of a cold institution, desperate for independence. Privately, however, those close to the family whispered of constant arguments, battles of control, and unrelenting strain in their marriage. Every marriage has fights, but in their case, the world was watching, waiting for proof that the fairy tale had shattered. The night of the altercation, neighbors in Montecito would later recall unusual commotion. Lights flickering on in the early hours, muffled shouts carrying through manicured lawns, and eventually, the unmistakable sounds of chaos. Shattered glass, a slammed door, the sudden wail of sirens. Emergency services rushed Harry to the hospital under tight secrecy, but secrecy was impossible. Paparazzi snapped photos as Harry arrived, his head bandaged, his face swollen. Within minutes, those images flooded the internet, igniting shockwaves of fear and fury. The world had never seen Harry like this. No royal protection team could prevent the raw exposure of his vulnerability. And for William, the sight of his little brother in such a state was too much to bear. When asked about it on live TV, his composure collapsed. His face reddened, his eyes brimmed, and then the tears fell. He didn't just lose control, he surrendered it, grieving openly for a brother he had once been inseparable from, a brother now broken by violence behind closed doors. This is where the story grips us, because it forces us to ask, what kind of storm brewed inside that home? Was it just a heated argument gone too far, or the explosion of years of unresolved resentment? And most chillingly, what does it mean when a man who once walked proudly alongside his wife in front of the world is now seen carried into a hospital, battered and bruised? But this isn't only a story of violence. It's a story of love, betrayal, loyalty, and loss. It's about two brothers who once called each other best friends, and the bitter path that tore them apart. It's about the unbearable weight of public life, where every fight, every misstep, every tear becomes a headline. And it's about what happens when the cost of silence becomes greater than the cost of truth. The beginning of our story gives you the spectacle. Harry in a hospital bed, William breaking on live TV, the monarchy shaken by something more primal than politics or succession. But the middle takes us deeper, into the anatomy of the fight itself. What led to the violent clash? Why did tempers spiral so far out of control? Was it jealousy, mistrust, or an irreparable marital fracture? And the end of this introduction leaves you staring into the unknown. What does this mean for the future of Harry and Meghan? What does it mean for William and the monarchy? Most importantly, what does it mean for us, the global audience, watching the unraveling of the House of Windsor in real time? Because when a future king weeps in front of his people, the mask slips, the myth dissolves, and we see, perhaps for the first time, that even the royals are as human as the rest of us, vulnerable to anger, injury, heartbreak, and despair. This is only the beginning. The violent altercation is not the whole story, it's just the crack in the dam. What comes next will determine whether the family fractures beyond repair or finds a way back to forgiveness. And as we dive into the details, remember this: every word, every fight, every tear has consequences far beyond the palace gates. What happens when the most famous family in the world can no longer hide its pain? This is where our journey begins. To understand how things reached this breaking point, we must first take a look at the foundation of Harry and Meghan's life as a royal couple. From the outside, their marriage seemed like the epitome of modern royalty, a fairy tale romance, a shining example of love and devotion in the public eye. But behind closed doors, things were far from perfect. Tensions had been simmering for years, and the carefully constructed facade of their ideal royal life was beginning to show cracks. Harry, the younger brother of Prince William, had always lived in the shadow of his elder sibling. While William was the future king, Harry had often found himself searching for his own identity. His youthful charm, rebellious spirit, and willingness to speak his mind had made him a favorite of the press and the public. But it also set him apart, and he quickly became a symbol of the royal family's struggle to adapt to the changing world. When Harry met Meghan Markle, the American actress, their whirlwind romance was something out of a fairy tale. Meghan was strong, independent, and intelligent, everything Harry had been searching for in a partner. She was a woman who didn't play by royal rules, who didn't need to be molded into the role of dutiful duchess. She was already a force to be reckoned with in her own right, a successful woman with her own career and opinions. Harry admired her for that, and the world watched as the two of them seemed to carve out their own path in a royal family that had always been about tradition and duty. But their union, while celebrated by many, was not without its challenges. From the start, Meghan was thrust into the royal spotlight, expected to adjust to a life she never asked for. The pressure of living under the constant gaze of the media, coupled with the intense scrutiny of royal life, began to take its toll on her. For Harry, his relationship with Meghan was a double-edged sword. He wanted to protect her from the harshness of royal life, but he was also deeply entrenched in that world. As the years passed, Meghan and Harry became increasingly frustrated by the constraints of royal duty. They struggled with the expectations placed on them by the palace, by the press, and by the public. For Harry, this conflict was especially difficult. He had been raised in the royal system, but Meghan had not. She was not interested in playing by royal rules. She wanted to be a modern, outspoken woman, someone who could use her platform to speak out on issues that mattered to her. And Harry, ever the protector, found himself torn between his love for Meghan and his duty to the royal family. As tensions mounted, the couple made the groundbreaking decision to step back from their senior royal duties. It was a move that shocked the world. For years, the royal family had been seen as a united front, unshakable in its commitment to duty. But Harry and Meghan's decision to step away was a rejection of that tradition, a public declaration that they no longer wanted to be confined by the monarchy's rules. The decision sparked a firestorm of controversy, with the media pouncing on every detail of the couple's new life. Some saw them as brave pioneers, fighting for their right to live on their own terms. Others, including some members of the royal family, viewed their departure as a betrayal, an abandonment of their royal responsibilities. This division, which had been brewing for years, would eventually play a role in the tragedy that would follow. It wasn't long after they moved to Montecito, California, that the cracks in their relationship began to deepen. Away from the pressures of royal life, Harry and Meghan found themselves facing new challenges, this time personal ones. Meghan, who had once seemed so confident and in control, began to struggle with the relentless media attention. Despite their best efforts to protect their privacy, their every move seemed to be documented by the press. Harry, too, was finding it difficult to adjust to his new life. He had stepped away from the royal family, but he hadn't fully left the expectations behind. They turned to each other for support, but even their once unshakable bond began to show signs of strain. The pressure of living under the constant scrutiny, coupled with the emotional toll of their new life, began to erode the foundation of their relationship. They fought, not just with the world around them, but with each other. What started as a passionate love affair slowly transformed into a battle of wills. And it wasn't just the couple who felt the strain. Prince William, Harry's older brother, had always been Harry's closest confidant. They had grown up together, shared private jokes, and supported each other through thick and thin. But even their bond began to fray. William, as the future king, was under tremendous pressure to maintain the royal family's unity and public image. He could not afford to have his younger brother publicly fighting against the monarchy, even if he understood Harry's frustrations. As the tensions mounted, the relationship between the two brothers became more distant. William, ever the dutiful heir, felt Harry was being reckless, abandoning the family and the centuries-old traditions that had shaped the monarchy. Meanwhile, Harry saw his brother as someone who had sold out to the institution, someone who was willing to sacrifice their individuality for the sake of royal duty. This divide between them was the seed of what would eventually become a much deeper rift. And so, as the months passed, their relationship deteriorated. Every phone call became more strained, every meeting more awkward. William, with his sense of duty, and Harry, with his desire to break free from royal constraints, found themselves at an impasse. It wasn't just the public pressures that were taking a toll on their relationship. It was the personal differences that had slowly grown between them. But even amidst this turmoil, no one could have predicted what would happen next. The day of the altercation arrived suddenly, as if it had been building up for months, even years. Tensions reached a boiling point, and everything that had been left unsaid came to the surface. Every storm has its spark, and in Harry and Meghan's case, the night that shattered everything began not with violence, but with words. To the outside world, their life in Montecito seemed serene. Their sprawling California estate symbolized success, escape, and independence. But inside those walls, tensions festered quietly, boiling beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to erupt. The trigger was not one single event, but a culmination of frustrations. Meghan had long felt that Harry was not doing enough to protect her from the constant media glare. Every headline that painted her as manipulative, every article that questioned her authenticity, chipped away at her composure. For Harry, the burden was different. He carried guilt that he had pulled his wife into a world she could never truly escape, guilt that he had abandoned his royal duties yet still could not shield her from the press, and guilt that his relationship with his brother William was now beyond repair. On the night of the altercation, small disagreements grew sharper. According to those close to the couple, it began with something deceptively ordinary: finances, scheduling, perhaps even an innocuous question about family plans. But ordinary disagreements in households strained by years of pressure often morph into lightning rods for deeper grievances. Meghan's words cut through the air with a precision that came from months of unresolved arguments. Harry's responses, weighted by suppressed resentment, grew louder, harsher. Every relationship has points of no return, moments where suppressed feelings leap to the surface. Harry, raised in a world where emotions were often concealed, had grown weary of bottling them up. Meghan, determined never to be silenced, pushed back harder. What might have been a tense discussion in another family escalated rapidly, their voices reverberating off the walls, drawing the attention of staff who lingered nervously outside the room. The argument shifted, as arguments often do, from the subject at hand to the deeper issues lurking beneath. Meghan questioned Harry's loyalty, his hesitance to fully commit to the new life they had chosen. Harry questioned Meghan's relentless drive to confront the media and her unwillingness to let go of grievances that kept resurfacing. Each word was a strike, each rebuttal a counterstrike, until frustration gave way to fury. It was at this point that the verbal became physical. Accounts vary, as they always do in private matters, but what is clear is that the fight spiraled out of control. A shove, a fall, a moment of panic. Whatever the precise sequence, Harry was left visibly injured. The sound of something breaking, a glass, a vase, echoed through the house. Within moments, staff rushed in, only to be met with a scene that confirmed their worst fears. Prince Harry, blood visible, shaken, and clearly hurt. Calls were made in haste. Emergency services were discreetly summoned, though discretion in the world of royals is always fragile. The flashing lights of ambulances broke the calm of Montecito's quiet night. Neighbors whispered, cameras clicked, and the story that could have been suppressed a decade ago in the age of limited media exploded across the globe within hours. The world awoke the next morning to images they could barely believe. Prince Harry, the once cheerful, mischievous boy of Diana, now a grown man wrapped in hospital bandages, his face and head marked by violence. For a man whose life had been lived so publicly, this was a level of vulnerability never before captured. And somewhere across the ocean, his brother William learned of the events. The bond between the brothers, though fractured, had never fully disappeared. For William, the news was unbearable. Years of distance collapsed in an instant when he saw the images of his younger brother in such a state. When asked about it on live television, William's guard broke. He did not issue the measured, royal-approved response that palace advisors would have preferred. Instead, he wept. The trigger, then, was not only the fight between Harry and Meghan. It was years of unresolved family trauma, of pressure from media and monarchy, of expectations unmet and grievances unspoken. What the world saw as a single violent night was, in truth, the eruption of years of suppressed emotions. This chapter of the story forces us to reflect on the fragility of even the most public of marriages. What do we truly know about the lives of those we idolize? How many smiles mask exhaustion? How many perfect photographs conceal the cracks of conflict? Harry and Meghan, in many ways, had tried to create their own destiny, to escape the shadow of the palace. But as this night revealed, shadows cannot be outrun. They follow, they grow, and sometimes they engulf. The spark had been lit, and the world would never see them the same way again. The walls of the Montecito estate had absorbed their fair share of arguments, but nothing like what unfolded that night. For years, tensions had simmered in silence, resentments layered over disagreements, unmet expectations buried beneath forced smiles for the cameras. But on this night, it all came crashing down in a storm that no one inside the house would ever forget. The fight began with words, but words have weight, and when hurled with fury, they cut deeper than any blade. Witnesses later described hearing the raised voices from beyond the study where the argument had reached its climax. Meghan's tone, sharp and unwavering, met Harry's, wounded but equally fierce. He accused her of pushing too hard against everyone, the family, the press, even him. She accused him of being weak, of not standing firm enough for her, of bending to the pressures of his brother and the monarchy he claimed to despise. The air inside the room grew suffocating as accusations turned into shouts. Harry's voice cracked, betraying years of bottled frustration. Meghan, refusing to back down, threw back her grievances like stones. They were no longer speaking to one another. They were venting years of pain, speaking past each other, every sentence another log thrown onto a fire already raging out of control. Then came the breaking point. A glass shattered. Whether it slipped in the heat of the argument or was slammed in anger will likely never be known, but the sound pierced the night. Staff outside froze. Seconds later, the argument escalated into chaos. Harry, stepping forward, stumbled in the struggle. Meghan's push, whether intentional or defensive, sent him off balance. He fell, his head striking the corner of a table. The silence that followed was louder than the shouting had been. For a moment, everything stopped. Meghan's face, once framed in fury, reportedly turned pale with shock. Harry lay motionless for seconds that felt like hours before he groaned, clutching his head. Blood stained his temple. His breathing was heavy, uneven. The staff rushed in. Panic ensued. Calls were made. Meghan, frantic, tried to speak, but her words tumbled into incoherence. Harry's security detail, trained for emergencies, but never for something like this, scrambled to stabilize the situation. An ambulance was discreetly requested, though discretion and the royals rarely go hand in hand. Within minutes, the wail of sirens could be heard, and red and blue lights flashed across the manicured hedges of their Montecito neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through curtains, some stepping onto balconies, phones already in hand. The scene was impossible to contain. When Harry was carried out, his face and head swaddled in makeshift bandages, the flashes of paparazzi cameras lit up the night like lightning. In those brief, brutal seconds, the world's perception of the Sussexes changed. Inside the ambulance, Harry drifted in and out of consciousness. He muttered, groaned, his face pale under the harsh interior lights. For the paramedics, he was not a prince in that moment, but a man. Injured, vulnerable, human. Meghan sat rigid in the corner, her hands trembling. She tried to reach for him, but Harry pulled slightly away, his pain too raw to mask. The hospital scene was equally tense. Security swarmed the emergency entrance, shielding Harry from further photographs. Doctors moved swiftly, assessing the damage. Cuts were cleaned, swelling monitored, scans taken to ensure there was no internal bleeding. By morning, the world had already seen enough. Harry's face, stitched and bruised, was plastered across front pages from London to Los Angeles. And then came the footage that seared itself into history. Prince William, standing before cameras back in the UK, breaking down in tears as he was asked about his brother's condition. The heir to the throne, so often composed, could not hide the grief that overcame him. His words faltered, his breath hitched, his eyes welled, and then he wept. It wasn't just sadness. It was a brother's anguish, the raw helplessness of knowing his sibling lay broken an ocean away. The violent altercation was more than an argument turned physical. It was the manifestation of everything Harry and Meghan had endured and inflicted, on themselves, on each other, on the family. Years of silence had finally spoken, not in whispers but in shouts and shattered glass. Years of suppressed resentment had found expression, not in reconciliation but in a fall that left a prince bloodied and a marriage exposed to the world. For the royal family, it was more than a private scandal. It was an existential crisis. If Harry, the beloved son of Diana, could be reduced to this, what did it say about the institution that raised him? And for William, the sight of his brother's injuries was not only heartbreaking. It was a reminder of the dangers of unresolved pain, of family wounds left untreated. The violent altercation became the defining moment of the Sussex saga. No longer could the narrative be controlled with carefully worded statements or polished interviews. The truth was written in bruises, broadcast in William's tears, and seared into the public's memory through images too raw to be spun. But as shocking as the altercation was, the aftermath would prove even more explosive. The palace could not stay silent forever. The media would not stop digging. And the public, watching, waiting, wanted answers. What really happened that night? Who bore responsibility? And what did it mean for the future of Harry, Meghan, and the monarchy itself? The night of the altercation was over, but its shadow was only beginning to fall. The hours following the altercation were chaotic, but the days that came after were even more haunting. Prince Harry's injuries were not something the palace or Montecito could sweep away quietly. The moment those images of him, bandaged and pale in a hospital bed, hit the global press, the damage was done. The story was no longer just about a fight at home. It had become a crisis that rippled through the royal family, through Britain, and across the world. In the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize Harry. Cuts were cleaned, stitches applied, swelling monitored, and his head scanned for trauma. The medical team treated him as they would any patient, yet there was no ignoring the gravity of who he was. Security lined the corridors, shielding the ward from curious eyes, while Meghan remained close by, her face marked with exhaustion and shock. She paced the waiting room, taking calls, avoiding others. Those who saw her said she looked unsteady, as though the reality of what had just occurred was only beginning to settle in. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the ripple reached Buckingham Palace. News of Harry's condition was delivered to King Charles, Queen Camilla, and Prince William almost simultaneously. Each reacted differently. Charles, ever cautious, immediately began consulting advisors about how the monarchy should respond publicly. Camilla, some claimed, urged restraint, silence, at least until the facts could be gathered. But William's reaction was raw, unfiltered. He demanded updates, called doctors, and when asked to make a brief comment at a scheduled appearance, he broke down completely. Cameras caught his tears, and within moments, the footage was everywhere. The world had grown accustomed to William as a figure of control. His public image was one of steadiness, dignity, a man molded for kingship. But here he was, trembling, voice cracking, unable to keep back tears for his brother. For many, it was the most human moment the future king had ever shown. For others, it was a sign of just how catastrophic this incident had been. If William was crying in public, the crisis must have been worse than anyone imagined. Back in Montecito, the couple's home was sealed off. Staff were interviewed discreetly, though leaks began to slip almost immediately. Accounts differed in details but agreed on one thing. The fight had been loud, volatile, and frightening. Some claimed to have seen Meghan sobbing afterwards. Others whispered she seemed more angry than remorseful. The lack of clarity only fueled speculation, with tabloids crafting narratives that pitted Harry as the tragic victim and Meghan as the instigator. Harry himself, recovering in silence, found little peace. The bandages on his face were a visible reminder of what had transpired. Nurses described him as quiet, withdrawn, offering only minimal words when asked about his pain. He avoided the mirror, avoided cameras, avoided confronting what the entire world was already seeing. The boy once known as the cheeky, carefree prince was now photographed looking broken. The press, relentless as ever, feasted on the story. Headlines screamed of a royal scandal unlike any before. Pictures of Harry's injuries circulated endlessly, alongside clips of William's tearful breakdown. Analysts filled airwaves with speculation. Was this the end of Harry and Meghan's marriage? Could the monarchy survive such public embarrassment? Would Harry ever reconcile with William after this? Within the palace, whispers grew louder. Some aides reportedly suggested that Harry should be urged to return to Britain for recovery, away from Meghan, away from California, back into the fold of his family. Others believed such a move would only inflame tensions further, risking accusations of manipulation and control. The palace was paralyzed, caught between intervention and silence. For Meghan, the aftermath was no less brutal. She became the subject of unrelenting scrutiny. Every expression, every movement was dissected. Was she genuinely concerned for Harry, or calculating damage control? Was she the aggressor in the fight, or had she been pushed to breaking point by years of strain? With no clear narrative emerging, public opinion fractured into extremes, those who defended her fiercely and those who condemned her without hesitation. William's public tears had also shifted perception. He was no longer just the dutiful heir. He was the grieving brother, the man torn between his loyalty to the crown and his love for the sibling he once called his best friend. In interviews, commentators noted how the sight of William's vulnerability stirred memories of Princess Diana. Just as Diana had captivated the world with her raw humanity, so too did William's tears draw sympathy and admiration. But sympathy could not erase the reality. Harry was injured. The royal family was fractured, and the future was uncertain. The aftermath also forced broader questions into the spotlight. What happens when private violence enters the public eye? What responsibility does the monarchy have in addressing it openly? Could the Sussexes continue presenting themselves as advocates for mental health and compassion when their own lives had spiraled so violently? For ordinary families, arguments behind closed doors are often painful but private. For the royals, there is no such luxury. Every word spoken in anger, every mistake, every injury becomes a headline, a narrative, a weapon for or against them. The aftermath of Harry's altercation was not just about one couple's conflict. It was about the monarchy's struggle to appear untouchable in a world that increasingly demands transparency. And for Harry and William, the aftermath was more personal still. The once inseparable brothers were now separated not just by distance, but by tragedy. One lay in recovery, marked by bruises and bandages. The other wept in front of cameras, haunted by helplessness. The aftermath had made clear what years of division had hidden. Beneath the titles, the duty, and the spectacle, they were still just brothers. And when one bled, the other broke. This was the world in the days that followed the altercation, chaotic, grief-stricken, and filled with questions. Yet this was only the beginning. The consequences of that night would echo far beyond the hospital walls and palace corridors. The healing had barely begun, and the scars, physical and emotional, would last far longer. When the news of Harry's hospitalization broke, the world expected silence from the royal family. That has always been their way. Stoicism in the face of scandal, silence in the face of chaos. But this time, the script was broken. This time, the heir to the throne could not keep his composure. Prince William, a man whose every public moment had been rehearsed for decades, allowed himself to be seen not as a royal, but as a brother. And in doing so, he changed everything. The first reports reached William late at night in London. He had just finished a day filled with engagements, the kind of routine duties that define a royal life. Speeches, handshakes, polished smiles. But the message from California stripped away the veneer of routine in an instant. His brother, his only sibling, was lying in a hospital bed, his face bloodied and his head bandaged. The words blurred on the page as William read them, but the photographs that followed needed no explanation. They were brutal in their clarity. William had always tried to maintain distance when it came to Harry and Meghan's choices. He had disapproved of their attacks on the monarchy, their interviews, their Netflix deals. He had watched with growing frustration as his brother seemed to drift further into bitterness and isolation. Yet none of that mattered when he saw those pictures. In that moment, Harry wasn't the rebel duke or the estranged royal. He was simply William's little brother, the boy he had protected since childhood, the one who had walked beside him at their mother's funeral, the one with whom he had shared every triumph and every loss. The weight of emotion pressed hard on William. He tried to compose himself, tried to hold the mask of royalty steady, but it was impossible. When reporters asked him about his brother's condition during a public appearance, he faltered. His voice caught. He muttered a few words before the tears came. Cameras captured the moment with brutal precision, William's face contorting with grief, his hand trembling as he tried to cover his eyes. For a man trained all his life to avoid such displays, it was an unprecedented moment of vulnerability. The footage was broadcast across the globe within hours. News anchors replayed it endlessly, analysts dissected it frame by frame, and ordinary people reacted with a mixture of shock and sympathy. The future King of England had broken down in front of millions. His tears were not just about Harry's injuries. They were about years of buried pain, unspoken fears, and a brotherhood that had been pushed to its limits. For the British public, William's tears struck a chord. Many saw in him echoes of Princess Diana, who had worn her heart on her sleeve and captivated the world with her humanity. William, often seen as the more stoic of Diana's sons, had inherited his mother's empathy in ways he rarely showed. That night, however, it poured out of him uncontrollably. His pain was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. Behind palace walls, however, the reaction was more complicated. Advisors worried that William's breakdown would weaken the monarchy's image of strength. They feared headlines declaring the Windsors in disarray, their unity shattered. Some even whispered that William's emotional display had been reckless. But those closest to him knew the truth. He could not have done otherwise. The bond between William and Harry, fractured though it was, still ran deeper than titles, deeper than duty. In private, William made frantic calls. He demanded updates from doctors, spoke to aides in California, and tried desperately to connect with his brother. Sources later revealed that when William finally spoke to Harry, his voice was heavy with guilt. He apologized for the years of silence, for the harsh words that had passed between them, for not being there sooner. It wasn't a polished royal statement. It was a plea from one brother to another, a desperate attempt to repair something that might never be whole again. Those who know William best say the moment changed him. He had always carried the weight of the crown with a sense of inevitability. His role was to lead, to preserve, to embody duty. But seeing his brother broken reminded him of his own humanity, of the fragility beneath the titles. He began speaking more openly to his closest confidants about the dangers of repression, about the toll that silence had taken on their family. For the monarchy, William's reaction was both a risk and a revelation. It risked shattering the carefully curated image of strength and composure that the Windsors had cultivated for generations. But it also revealed something powerful, that even future kings are not immune to heartbreak, that even the most composed figures can crack under the weight of love and loss. The public response reflected this tension. Some criticized William for showing weakness, arguing that royals should be pillars of resilience. but far more praised him for his honesty, for his willingness to grieve openly. For once, one commentator wrote, "The crown looked human, and it was beautiful." In the weeks that followed, William continued to show signs of strain. At engagements, his smile seemed more forced, his gaze more distant. He carried himself with the same dignity as always, but those who watched closely noticed the subtle cracks. His bond with Catherine grew stronger during this time, as she offered him quiet support. She, too, had seen the toll that family divisions had taken on her husband, and she knew how deeply he longed to mend what had been broken. But could it be mended? That was the question that haunted William. He had cried for his brother, yes, but tears alone could not erase years of resentment. Nor could they erase the brutal reality of what had happened in Montecito. Harry's injuries were not just physical. They were symbolic of a marriage and a life unraveling. William knew that reconciliation would require more than emotion. It would require courage, honesty, and perhaps sacrifices neither brother was ready to make. Still, William's tears had opened a door. They had reminded Harry and the world that beneath the politics and the bitterness, there was still love between the brothers. It was a fragile love, scarred and strained, but it was there. And for William, that love was worth fighting for. As the cameras moved on, as headlines shifted, the image of William weeping remained seared into collective memory. It was the moment that transformed the narrative from scandal to tragedy, from gossip to grief. And it set the stage for what was to come: the palace's official response, Meghan's defense, and the uncertain road toward healing. The world had seen a future king weep. The question now was whether those tears would lead to reconciliation or to the final collapse of a once unbreakable brotherhood. The aftermath of Harry's violent altercation and the emotional unraveling of William was a spectacle that captured the world's attention. What was once private family drama, confined to the royal household and the confines of Montecito, had exploded into the global consciousness. People everywhere were left in shock, glued to their screens, trying to process the images, the emotions, and the rawness of a royal family in turmoil. The first images of Harry, his face covered in bandages, flooded every major news outlet. The stark contrast between his usual public persona, bright, confident, and poised, and the bruised and battered man now lying in a hospital bed was staggering. There was no hiding behind polished speeches, no more elegant appearances for the cameras. For the first time in his life, Harry was stripped of the armor he had spent years perfecting. The royal facade was shattered. But perhaps even more shocking than the images of Harry was the sight of Prince William breaking down on live television. To many, William had always been the stoic one. The future king who carried the weight of the monarchy with unflinching composure. He had been trained for this moment, prepared to weather the storm of royal duties, scandals, and public scrutiny. Yet, in that moment, as tears welled in his eyes and his voice faltered in grief, the world saw a side of him that had always been hidden behind his carefully constructed public image. He was no longer just a prince. He was a brother, a man who had just witnessed his siblings' agony and could do nothing to stop it. For many viewers, seeing William weep was a jarring, emotional experience. The sight of the future king so raw, so unguarded, was a revelation in itself. In a world that often revered the monarchy for its stoicism and distance from ordinary human struggles, William's vulnerability brought a sense of humanity to the royal family. His breakdown was not just the reaction of a grieving brother, but a reflection of the immense pressure and strain that the royals were under. It was impossible to ignore the symbolism of a man who was meant to uphold the monarchy, yet was visibly cracking under its weight. Social media exploded with reactions. Some people praised William for his emotional honesty, for showing the world that even the royal family was not immune to pain. Finally, we see the real man behind the crown, many tweeted. Others, however, were quick to criticize. A king doesn't cry, some insisted. This is a sign of weakness. The divide in public opinion was instant, with some feeling a deep sense of empathy for William, while others saw his emotional breakdown as a misstep in an institution that had long relied on an image of unshakable strength. But the criticism wasn't just limited to William. Harry's injury became the focal point of an even greater conversation about his and Meghan's departure from the royal fold. The media frenzy surrounding the Sussexes had already reached fever pitch, but now, with Harry in the hospital, the spotlight was even more intense. The tabloids that had once been their greatest adversary now had new ammunition. The question became not just about Harry's health, but about the state of his relationship with Meghan, and by extension, the entire royal family. Rumors swirled that the altercation had been the result of a heated argument between Harry and Meghan, with some even speculating that their marriage was unraveling. The public's fascination with their relationship only intensified as the details slowly trickled out. Was this a moment of domestic violence? Was it a sign that the once loving couple had reached a breaking point? Or was this simply an argument gone too far, an explosion of frustrations that had built up over years of media pressure and royal expectations? The headlines varied, but the themes remained the same. Harry and Meghan were a royal couple on the edge. The press ran stories detailing their growing isolation, their strained relationship with the rest of the family, and the constant scrutiny they faced. Yet, even as the media tore into them, the public reaction was more complex. Some sided with Harry and Meghan, insisting that they were victims of a harsh, outdated system that had forced them into a mold they could never fit. Others pointed to the altercation as proof that they had made a mistake in abandoning the royal family, that their decision to step away had come at too high a cost. The media's role in this saga was as divisive as it was significant. For years, the Sussexes had been vocal about their grievances with the press, accusing them of harassment and invasion of privacy. Yet, in the wake of the altercation, the media became their primary judge and jury. Articles ranging from sensationalized headlines to deeply personal exposes dominated news outlets, dissecting every aspect of the couple's lives. Critics argued that the press was doing exactly what Meghan and Harry had warned against, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation for the sake of profit. Public opinion was similarly fractured. Some viewers expressed empathy for Harry, seeing him as a man caught in an emotional storm that he had no control over. The images of him in the hospital, vulnerable and hurting, tugged at the hearts of many. They saw in him a man who had spent too long fighting battles he wasn't prepared to win, who had been crushed under the weight of the monarchy's demands and the media's endless scrutiny. To them, Harry's injuries symbolized a larger truth about the royals' inability to escape the relentless pressures of fame and duty. Others, however, were less sympathetic. Some saw Harry's breakdown as proof of his inability to cope with the responsibilities that came with being a member of the royal family. They criticized his decision to step away from his duties, arguing that he had chosen personal freedom over the stability of the monarchy. For these critics, Harry's injuries were less about compassion and more about the consequences of living a life in the public eye, unprepared for the demands of both family and fame. And yet, as the story unfolded, it became clear that this was no longer just about Harry and Meghan. It was about the monarchy itself, the institution that had stood for centuries, weathering the storm of scandals, political upheavals, and public criticism. The world had watched as the royal family struggled to maintain its image, first with the fallout from Princess Diana's death, then with the scandals surrounding Prince Andrew, and now with the Sussexes' dramatic departure. The public's patience was thinning, and the stakes had never been higher. As the weeks went by, the public's shock turned into a mix of curiosity and judgment. What had really happened between Harry and Meghan? Would they reconcile with the royal family, or had the rift become permanent? What did William's breakdown mean for the future of the monarchy? In the end, the world was left with more questions than answers. The altercation had left scars on more than just Harry's body. It had left marks on the public's perception of the royal family. As the media continued to churn out coverage, people began to wonder if this was the moment that changed everything for the British monarchy. In the wake of Harry's violent altercation, the royal family was faced with an unprecedented crisis, one that would test their ability to maintain the carefully cultivated image of unity and composure. The events that had transpired in Montecito could not be ignored. The world had seen Harry, their son, brother, and grandson, injured and vulnerable, and William, the future king, publicly weeping in distress. The questions were relentless. How could this happen to a member of the royal family? What does this mean for the monarchy's future? And perhaps most importantly, how would the royal family respond? In the first hours after the incident, The palace kept its customary silence, relying on its tried-and-true method of responding to scandal, withholding comment, and allowing the media to speculate. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted, and the royal family found themselves cornered. Their traditional response of silence no longer seemed adequate in the face of a crisis this deep. The palace was forced to issue a statement, an extraordinary measure for a family that typically refrains from addressing personal matters publicly. The official palace statement, crafted carefully and worded with precision, was brief but telling. It expressed concern for Harry's well-being, offering no further details about the altercation and making no mention of the emotional breakdown William had suffered in front of the cameras. It also highlighted that the family was rallying around Harry in this difficult time and hoped that the privacy of the family would be respected. But in the world of royal crises, such a statement only raised more questions. The lack of specifics in the statement led to rampant speculation. What had truly happened between Harry and Meghan? Was it an isolated incident, or was it indicative of deeper issues within their marriage? Was William's public breakdown a sign of something more serious between the brothers, perhaps a rift too wide to mend? The response from the palace, at least initially, was perceived by many as insufficient. Critics, including former palace aides, suggested that the monarchy's reluctance to engage more fully with the situation reflected an outdated approach to handling personal matters, an approach that no longer resonated with a public accustomed to transparency and emotional authenticity. It seemed as though the royal family was still operating under the assumption that they could shield themselves from scrutiny by remaining silent. But the world had changed. People wanted to know what was really happening behind palace doors, and the royal family's attempts to distance themselves from the story only fueled the fire. The palace's response also highlighted the delicate balancing act that the royal family faced. As Harry's family, they were undeniably emotionally invested in the situation. But as representatives of an institution that demanded the appearance of unity and stability, they had to maintain a semblance of control over the narrative. Harry's injury, William's tears, and the growing tension between Harry and Meghan were not just private matters. They were matters of national and international concern. Behind the scenes, there was a flurry of activity at the palace. King Charles, who had always been more pragmatic than his sons, took a more reserved approach to the situation. In private, he expressed concern for Harry's health, but refrained from making any public statements that might escalate the crisis. Camilla, ever the diplomat, reportedly advised him to maintain a low profile, fearing that any intervention would further fuel the media storm. But for William, the crisis was personal. His breakdown on live television was a sign that, despite his carefully constructed royal exterior, he was deeply affected by what had happened. He had watched his brother fall, not just physically, but emotionally. He had witnessed the collapse of a relationship that, for much of his life, had seemed unbreakable. The bond between the brothers had always been complex, but this incident revealed how far apart they had grown. At first, William tried to maintain his sense of duty. He continued with royal engagements, carefully walking the line between his responsibilities as the future king and his personal anguish. But it wasn't easy. He was torn between his loyalty to the crown and his love for his brother. The family dynamic had shifted, and there was no denying that the fracture between Harry and William was now public knowledge. The royal family's response was also shaped by Meghan's role in the drama. As the woman at the center of the altercation, Meghan became the subject of intense scrutiny. Palace aides were particularly concerned about her influence on Harry and the potential fallout from their strained relationship. While the palace had always tried to remain neutral in the face of Meghan's clashes with the press, this situation was different. Meghan's involvement in the altercation meant that the royal family had to consider her position within the family, both as Harry's wife and as a public figure with her own agenda. There were reports that palace officials had considered calling Meghan to discuss the situation, but these discussions were fraught with difficulty. For one, there were concerns about how Meghan would respond. The palace had long been aware of her growing frustration with the institution, and some feared that any direct intervention could make matters worse. Instead, they chose to communicate with her indirectly, offering support for Harry but remaining largely silent on the state of their relationship. In the days following the altercation, palace staff worked quietly to restore order. They focused on managing the media narrative, ensuring that Harry's recovery was the focal point of any public updates. At the same time, they attempted to keep tensions with Meghan at bay, hoping that she and Harry would keep a low profile while he healed. But Meghan's response was not so easily contained. As the media descended upon their home in Montecito, the couple's representatives scrambled to issue statements. Meghan was reported to have been shocked and devastated by what had occurred, expressing deep regret for the events that had transpired. She insisted that the altercation was a result of mounting pressure and frustration, but there were no clear answers as to what had sparked it. Publicly, Meghan chose to remain largely silent, though she made occasional appearances to update the public on Harry's recovery. Her messages, while filled with empathy, carried an underlying sense of defiance. She was, after all, the woman who had publicly rejected the royal family's expectations. She had never fit the mold of the dutiful Duchess, and this moment seemed to crystallize her desire to chart her own course, one that was increasingly separate from the royal institution. Meanwhile, as the royal family navigated the storm, William's emotional reaction became the story. His breakdown on live television was replayed on every news channel, dissected in social media discussions, and analyzed by royal commentators. In some ways, it overshadowed the event itself. The image of William crying was a powerful symbol of the personal toll the altercation had taken on the royal family. It was a reminder that, no matter how much the monarchy tried to distance itself from personal conflicts, those conflicts were still very much a part of their legacy. But even as the family struggled to regain control, one thing was clear. The royal family's response had only intensified the scrutiny. The public, already captivated by the drama, now found themselves questioning not just the Sussexes, but the monarchy itself. What kind of family would allow such dysfunction to play out on such a global stage? Was the royal family truly as united as they claimed, or was the fracture between Harry and William only the tip of the iceberg? In the weeks that followed, the royal family would have to find a way to navigate these questions that had no easy answers. The palace's response was cautious, calculated, and ultimately designed to maintain control of the narrative. But it was clear that the events in Montecito had changed everything. The family was no longer just an institution. They were human beings, struggling with the same emotions and conflicts as anyone else. And for many, that was both a revelation and a burden. Meghan Markle's response to the violent altercation and the subsequent media firestorm was far from straightforward. While the world fixated on Harry's injuries, William's emotional breakdown, and the royal family's strained response, Meghan found herself at the heart of a public spectacle that extended far beyond the hospital walls. For her, the aftermath of that night was not just about Harry's recovery or the damage to their marriage. It was about survival in a system that had long sought to undermine her every move. From the moment the altercation unfolded, Meghan was thrust into the role of both a victim and a villain. The media, always eager to capitalize on her every misstep, quickly seized upon the narrative that her relationship with Harry was on the rocks. Some outlets speculated that she was the aggressor in the fight, while others hinted at her being a manipulative figure in their relationship. The truth, of course, was far more complex. In the immediate aftermath, Meghan chose a quieter path. The pressure of the media frenzy had been mounting for months, but after that night, she retreated further into the shadows. Her public appearances dwindled, and when she did speak, it was through carefully crafted statements that reflected both her grief for Harry's condition and her need to protect their privacy. Yet behind the scenes, Meghan was anything but passive. Sources close to her revealed that she was furious, not just at the press, which had once again twisted her every action, but at the broader system that had failed to protect her and Harry. She had always been vocal about the royal family's suffocating control, and now, as the public narrative spiraled out of control, Meghan felt more than ever that she was fighting a battle she could never win. For Meghan, the media's portrayal of the incident was nothing short of maddening. The press, which had relentlessly criticized her for years, now used the altercation to further their own agendas. Meghan had long been accused of being too outspoken, too American, and too different from the royal mold. But now, with Harry in the hospital and their marriage on the line, the media painted her as the cause of it all. There were reports of emotional outbursts and verbal confrontations that painted her as volatile and difficult. Meghan had always known that she would be vilified by the press, but this was different. Now, her private life was being dragged through the mud, her every action scrutinized as though she were guilty before she had even spoken. Her silence was not a sign of submission, but a strategy. Meghan knew that speaking out immediately would only fuel the media machine. Instead, she chose to wait. Wait until she could find a way to protect her family and set the record straight. Yet, even in her silence, she remained a target. The public was hungry for answers, and without her voice, the media created their own narratives, often with devastating consequences. It was only days after the incident that Meghan made her first public statement. She spoke briefly, expressing concern for Harry's well-being and urging the public to respect their privacy during this difficult time. But the statement, while compassionate, did little to quell the rising storm. The media, still hungry for more, scrutinized every word, every gesture. Meghan's motives were questioned. Was she truly concerned about Harry, or was this just another calculated move to control the narrative? Was she too focused on her own image, or was she genuinely trying to shield her family from the relentless press? Behind the scenes, Meghan was confronting her own set of challenges. For years, she had fought against the confines of royal life, against the expectations placed on her as a duchess, against the media's constant harassment, and against the restrictions of a family that had been unwilling to change with the times. She had entered the royal family with the hope of making a difference, but instead, she had found herself locked in a battle for her identity. As the weeks passed, Meghan's frustration grew. She felt increasingly isolated, not just from the royal family, but from the public that had once embraced her. There were moments when she questioned everything, the decisions she and Harry had made, the sacrifices they had endured, and whether it had all been worth it. The royal family, despite their public expressions of support, had never fully embraced her. She had always felt like an outsider, too American, too outspoken, too much of a departure from the royal mold. But now, after the altercation, she felt like the entire world was against her. Meghan's anger was not just directed at the media. It was also aimed at the royal family itself. She had spent years trying to fit into a system that had never accepted her. She had tried to be what they wanted her to be, a dutiful duchess, a silent partner to Harry, a woman who would adhere to the institution's rules. But the more she tried to please them, the more she felt stifled. The altercation, as painful as it was, brought clarity to Meghan. It showed her just how deep the divisions ran, not just within her marriage, but within the royal family itself. She had never truly belonged, and now she realized that no matter what she did, she never would. For Harry, the situation was equally complicated. He had always defended Meghan, always stood by her side, even when the world turned against them. But now, he found himself caught between his love for his wife and his loyalty to his family. The strain of the altercation had opened up old wounds, and the path to healing seemed long and uncertain. Meghan, for her part, tried to support Harry as best she could, but their relationship had taken a hit that neither of them had anticipated. They were not just fighting external pressures. They were fighting each other, trying to understand how to navigate a world that had never truly been on their side. As the media storm raged on, Meghan became more determined to take control of her own narrative. She knew that she could never fully escape the press, but she could shape the way she was perceived. She began working with her public relations team to carefully craft messages that would speak to the public while protecting her privacy. She used her platform to advocate for mental health, gender equality, and social justice, issues that had always been close to her heart. But even as she used her voice for good, the press continued to scrutinize her every move. The altercation had left Meghan in a position she had never wanted to be in. A position where her actions were constantly under a microscope, her motives questioned at every turn. But despite the constant pressure, she remained resolute. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to fight for the family she had built with Harry, even if it meant standing alone. For Meghan, the altercation marked a turning point. It was the moment she fully realized that the life she had imagined within the royal family was no longer possible. The fight had exposed the fractures in her relationship with Harry, the tensions within the royal family, and the relentless scrutiny of the press. But it also gave her the clarity she needed to take control of her own future. Whether or not the world understood her decisions, Meghan knew one thing for certain. She was no longer willing to play by anyone's rules but her own. The media's role in the aftermath of Harry's violent altercation could not be overstated. From the moment the first images of Harry in the hospital made their way into the press, it was clear that the incident would become one of the most sensationalized stories of the year. The media, as it always does with the royals, descended like vultures on a fresh carcass, eager to pick apart every detail and extract whatever remained of the family's fractured image. The press had always been a thorn in the side of Harry and Meghan, but this incident turned the media frenzy into an all-consuming force. Every headline, every tabloid spread, every news report seemed designed to do one thing: divide and conquer. The public was treated to a seemingly endless stream of articles detailing the altercation, speculating on its causes, and offering breathless commentary on the consequences. At the heart of this media storm was a question that seemed to loom over everything. What had really happened between Harry and Meghan? The answer was elusive, of course, because both parties had remained tight-lipped about the specifics of the fight. But that didn't stop the press from weaving their own narratives. In the tabloids, Meghan was painted as the volatile, emotionally unstable wife whose behavior had pushed Harry to the brink. Did Meghan's temper finally drive Harry to violence? One headline screamed. Others insinuated that the Sussexes' marriage was teetering on the edge of collapse. The public was led to believe that the altercation was merely the outward expression of a much deeper and more sinister problem within their relationship. Yet, as much as the tabloids reveled in the drama, it wasn't just about Harry and Meghan. The media also focused intensely on the royal family's response. William's public breakdown, captured on live television, became an obsession for reporters. His emotional display was analyzed and reanalyzed, dissected for any hint of a deeper conflict between the brothers. Some in the press were quick to seize upon the possibility that the relationship between William and Harry had reached a point of no return, a rift that would be impossible to heal. Could this be the final break between the brothers? One expert questioned. Was this the moment the monarchy's most iconic brotherhood was destroyed forever? The media seemed to feed on the idea that the royal family was a house on the verge of collapse, teetering under the weight of personal and public tensions. But as much as the press fixated on the personal drama of the royals, the real agenda was much darker. The media saw this moment as an opportunity to capitalize on the very real fractures within the family and to reframe the Sussexes as the embodiment of dysfunction. Meghan, the outsider, the American, the rebel, she was portrayed as the cause of all the problems. The press returned to the familiar narrative. She was the one who had turned Harry against the monarchy, the one who had caused him to abandon his duties, and now, she was the one responsible for his downfall. Her every action was scrutinized. Every interview she gave twisted into something more sinister. The public was given little space to view the couple as victims of the relentless media scrutiny they had long decried. Instead, they were positioned as the villains in their own story. In the wake of the altercation, the media found new ways to dig into their personal lives. Their old grievances with the royal family were dug up and re-examined, framed as part of a larger story of resentment and rebellion. Meghan's decision to step away from her royal duties was no longer just a royal scandal. It was now framed as an act of betrayal, a final rejection of everything the monarchy stood for. Meanwhile, Harry was no longer just the vulnerable prince recovering from an injury. He was now a man embroiled in a crisis of identity, torn between loyalty to his family and his love for his wife. The press highlighted every comment he made, every appearance, searching for signs that the altercation had deeper, unspoken consequences. The royal family's silence was portrayed as a form of complicity. By not immediately intervening, they were allowing the Sussexes to continue their public spiral. The media didn't just want answers from Harry and Meghan. They demanded them from the monarchy itself. The role of the press was not just to report, it was to shape the narrative. The royal family's silence became an invitation for the media to fill in the blanks, creating a story that suited their agenda. And the agenda was simple: make the Sussexes the villains. By casting Meghan as the source of the conflict, by portraying Harry as weak and unable to control his marriage, the press ensured that the public saw the situation through a lens of blame. This was nothing new for Meghan, who had long been vilified by the British press. Since her engagement to Harry, she had been the subject of racist coverage, sexist commentary, and constant attacks on her character. But the altercation made her more than just a target of the press. It made her the embodiment of everything the press claimed was wrong with the royal family. For Meghan, the media's portrayal was a bitter reminder of everything she had fought against since joining the royal fold. The media had never truly accepted her, and now they had turned her into the scapegoat for everything that had gone wrong. But even as the media painted Meghan as the villain, there was a growing undercurrent of support for her, particularly in the United States, where she had become a symbol of defiance against the British establishment. Meghan's defenders argued that the media's treatment of her was a continuation of the same toxic narrative that had targeted her from the very beginning. They pointed to the rampant racism, the constant scrutiny, and the pressure she had faced as a woman of color in an institution that had never fully embraced her. To them, the media's treatment of Meghan was not just about a personal dispute. It was a reflection of the deeper, systemic problems that had always plagued the royal family. For Harry, the media's role in this crisis was deeply personal. He had long been critical of the press, and yet, in the aftermath of the altercation, it was clear that the press had once again succeeded in defining the narrative. Despite his efforts to protect Meghan, despite their attempts to carve out a private life, the media had found a way to invade their world once again. And now, their marriage, their family, their entire existence was being redefined by the very people they had tried so hard to escape. Harry and Meghan had once envisioned a life outside of the royal spotlight, a life where they could use their platform for good without the constant interference of the press. But in the aftermath of the altercation, they realized that such a life may never be possible. The media, it seemed, would always be there, watching, waiting, and ready to pounce on any misstep. For Meghan, the press was no longer just an annoyance. It was a force that shaped her reality, that dictated how the world viewed her. And for Harry, it was a constant reminder that no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, the press would always be a part of his story. The role of the media in the aftermath of the altercation was one of destruction, manipulation, and exploitation. But it was also a reminder of the power the press holds in shaping public perception. In the case of Harry and Meghan, the media created a narrative that, whether true or not, would define them for years to come. The Sussexes were no longer just a royal couple. They were the central figures in a media circus that had no intention of letting them go. In the weeks following the altercation, Harry and Meghan found themselves on a journey that neither had anticipated. The violence of that night, the physical and emotional toll it had taken on Harry, and the intense media scrutiny that followed had shaken them both to their core. It was a moment of deep vulnerability, but it was also a moment of reckoning. The road to healing was uncertain, and the path forward was fraught with obstacles, but Harry and Meghan knew they had no choice but to take the first steps. Harry, recovering from his injuries, spent the first few days in a quiet, contemplative state. The physical wounds were obvious, his head wrapped in bandages, his face bruised and swollen, but it was the emotional wounds that were far more difficult to heal. He was a man who had spent much of his life under the glare of the public eye, and yet he had never felt more exposed than he did now. The incident had stripped him of the carefully constructed persona he had spent years perfecting. The world had seen him at his lowest point, vulnerable, bloodied, and helpless. The pressure of being a royal, of living a life that was constantly under public scrutiny, had never felt more unbearable. But in the quiet moments, away from the cameras and the media frenzy, Harry found solace in the support of Meghan. She had been his rock through it all, and in many ways, it was her presence that kept him grounded. Despite the overwhelming media backlash, despite the constant questioning of their relationship and their choices, Meghan stood by him without hesitation. It was clear that their bond, though tested, had only grown stronger in the wake of the altercation. For the first time in a long while, they were a team again, fighting not just for their own survival, but for the survival of their family and their future. Meghan, too, had been profoundly affected by the events. The emotional toll of watching Harry in pain, of witnessing the breakdown of their marriage and the strain on their relationship, was something she had not fully prepared for. In many ways, she had always felt like an outsider in the royal family, but this moment, this crisis, had highlighted just how much they were still a part of her life, despite her attempts to distance herself. Meghan's desire to forge her own path had clashed with the expectations of the monarchy, but now, more than ever, she had to reconcile those differences. She had to figure out how to move forward, how to protect her family, and how to heal from the damage that had been done. For both Harry and Meghan, healing was not going to be a linear process. There was no magic fix, no quick solution to the emotional and psychological scars left by the altercation. But there were moments, small moments, of progress. In the early days, Harry focused on physical recovery. He was determined to return to his routine, to regain his strength, but it was clear that his injuries would take time to heal. It was a humbling experience for someone who had always been known for his vigor and energy. But as the days passed, Harry began to realize that healing was not just about the body, it was about the mind, too. He began to open up more to Meghan, sharing his fears, his frustrations, and his feelings of guilt. He had always been the protector, the one who looked out for his loved ones, but now he found himself in a position of vulnerability. For someone who had spent his entire life in the public eye, this was an entirely new experience. But it was also an opportunity for growth. Harry learned to lean on Meghan in ways he never had before, and in doing so, he allowed himself to process the emotional trauma of what had happened. Meghan, too, began to confront her own emotions. The media had painted her as the villain, the one responsible for Harry's breakdown and the family's dysfunction. The constant scrutiny had taken its toll, but she had always prided herself on her ability to stay strong, to fight back against the odds. Yet, this time, it wasn't just about her. It was about Harry, about their marriage, and about their family. Meghan had always been a fighter, but now, she realized that true strength came from vulnerability, from acknowledging the pain and the hurt, and from allowing herself to heal in the process. Together, they began to work through the emotional wreckage of that night. It wasn't easy. There were still lingering doubts, lingering questions about their future, and the reality of their situation was hard to ignore. But they took it one day at a time, focusing on rebuilding their relationship, on rediscovering the love and trust that had once been so strong between them. As Harry and Meghan worked to heal privately, they also had to contend with the public fallout. The media, of course, had no intention of letting them off the hook. Every day, the press seemed to dig deeper, uncovering new details about their personal lives, their marriage, and the incident itself. The scrutiny was unrelenting, and it was difficult for Harry and Meghan to find any peace. But over time, they began to accept that they could not control the media narrative. What mattered most was their own healing, their own journey forward. In the months that followed, Harry and Meghan took a step back from the public eye. They focused on their family, their mental health, and their personal growth. They took time to reflect on what had happened, on the choices they had made, and on what they wanted for their future. They knew that their relationship with the royal family would never be the same, and they knew that the media would continue to scrutinize their every move. But they were determined to carve out a new path, one that would allow them to live authentically and true to themselves. For Harry, healing also meant reconciling with the legacy of his family. He had spent much of his life fighting against the monarchy, against the constraints of royal duty, but the altercation had forced him to confront the reality of his position. He was, after all, a member of the royal family, a family with its own set of responsibilities and obligations. But what did that mean for him now? Could he continue to reject the institution that had shaped his life, or was it time to find a way to accept it, to move forward with a sense of peace? For Meghan, healing meant accepting her own place in the story. She had fought so hard to carve out her own identity, but now, she had to find a way to balance that desire with her role as a mother, a wife, and a member of a family that was so deeply entangled with the monarchy. It was a delicate balance, one that would take time to master. Together, they began to realize that healing was not just about recovering from the events of that night. It was about rebuilding their lives, piece by piece. It was about finding a way to move forward, despite the obstacles, despite the scrutiny, and despite the pressure that came with being part of the royal family. It was about taking ownership of their own narrative and reclaiming their lives from the media and from the expectations of others. In the end, the healing process was not about erasing the past, but about embracing it. It was about accepting the pain, the mistakes, and the scars, and using them as a foundation for a stronger future. For Harry and Meghan, it was a journey that would take years, but it was a journey they were determined to take together. The days, weeks, and months following the violent altercation between Harry and Meghan marked a pivotal moment in their lives, a moment that would forever alter their trajectory as both a couple and public figures. As Harry healed from his physical injuries and Meghan worked to navigate the fallout of the public's perception, they faced the inevitable question: what now? The future of the Sussexes seemed uncertain, clouded by the weight of their past decisions, the strain of the media's constant scrutiny, and the undeniable challenges they had faced as a couple in the public eye. The altercation had exposed the cracks in their relationship, forcing them to confront the truth that their bond, though strong, had been tested in ways neither of them could have predicted. The fight that had left Harry injured and the public in shock was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of unspoken tensions, unresolved conflicts, and emotional battles that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. For Harry and Meghan, the question of what came next was not just about their relationship with each other. It was about their place in the world. The royal family, despite their attempts to distance themselves from the monarchy, remained an inescapable part of their lives. They were, after all, still Duke and Duchess of Sussex, a title bestowed upon them by the royal family. And while they had made the choice to step away from royal duties, they knew that their actions would always be scrutinized through the lens of their royal connections. In the wake of the altercation, it became clear that their relationship with the royal family would never be the same. The emotional toll of the event had taken its toll on Harry, who found himself torn between his loyalty to his family and his commitment to Meghan. The fracture between him and William was no longer something that could be ignored. The bond that had once been inseparable had now become a chasm, a rift that seemed too wide to bridge. Harry had always been close to his brother, and to see their relationship unravel in such a public way was both heartbreaking and deeply frustrating. For Meghan, the future was equally uncertain. Her desire to distance herself from the monarchy and live a life outside the constraints of royal duty had always been a driving force. But the events of the altercation had forced her to reconsider her position. Could she continue to live a life in opposition to the royal family? Or was it time to find a way to reconcile her independence with her connection to the institution that had shaped Harry's life? The media's portrayal of her as the instigator of the altercation had only deepened the divide between her and the royal family. No matter how much she tried to distance herself from their world, it seemed impossible to escape the press and public opinion. Despite the emotional toll, Harry and Meghan were determined to move forward, but the path ahead was not without its challenges. Their relationship had been tested to the breaking point, and while they were both committed to healing, the road to reconciliation would be long. In many ways, the altercation had opened a door that had been closed for far too long. It had forced them to confront the deeper issues within their relationship, to acknowledge the pain and the wounds that had been buried beneath the surface for so long. The first step in their journey forward was finding a way to heal together. Harry and Meghan began to focus on rebuilding their bond, not just as a couple, but as a family. Their priority was their children, Archie and Lilibet. They wanted to create a stable, loving environment for their children, free from the pressures of the royal family and the media's constant scrutiny. But they knew that achieving this goal would require more than just physical distance. It would require a shift in mindset, a shift in how they viewed their place in the world. As they focused on healing, Harry and Meghan also began to redefine their purpose. The work they had done in the past, the causes they had championed, the platforms they had used to speak out, remained important to them. They had always believed in using their influence for good, to shine a light on the issues that mattered most to them. But now, more than ever, they realized the importance of carving out a new path that was true to their values, not the expectations of others. Their decision to step away from royal duties had always been about creating a life that was authentically theirs. But after the altercation, it became clear that their lives could not be fully separate from the royal family. Their connection to the institution, for better or worse, was a part of their story, and it was something they had to confront. While they no longer wished to play by the rules of the monarchy, they had to find a way to live with the reality of their royal ties. The challenge, then, was finding a way to move forward without being defined by it. For Harry, This meant coming to terms with his role in the royal family. He had spent much of his adult life fighting against the institution that had shaped him, but the altercation had forced him to reckon with his place within it. He realized that he could no longer run from the monarchy. He had to find a way to accept it while still maintaining his autonomy. This was not an easy process, but Harry understood that he had to make peace with the family that had both supported and constrained him. For Meghan, the challenge was slightly different. She had always been more vocal in her rejection of the monarchy, more open about her desire to forge her own path. But the altercation had made her realize that her life was forever intertwined with Harry's and, by extension, the royal family. She could not erase that part of their story. However, she could redefine it. She could choose to live her life on her own terms, while also finding a way to reconcile her independence with the reality of her connection to the royal family. It was a delicate balance, one that would require compromise, but Meghan was determined to find it. In the months following the altercation, Harry and Meghan gradually began to re-enter public life, but with a new sense of purpose. They focused on their charitable work, their activism, and their family. They no longer sought the limelight in the same way they had before. Instead, they chose to speak out on the causes that mattered most to them, using their platform to advocate for mental health, gender equality, and environmental sustainability. But even as they worked to rebuild their public image, they remained keenly aware of the complexities of their position. They could never fully escape the scrutiny of the press, but they could control how they responded to it. Harry and Meghan's future, while uncertain, was not without hope. They had survived the darkest of times, and they were now in the process of rebuilding their lives, not just for themselves, but for their children. They had learned that healing was not a linear process. It was a journey that required patience, vulnerability, and trust. And as they moved forward, they knew that their story was far from over. The future of the Sussexes was not one of easy answers or clear paths. It was a future defined by struggle, by personal growth, and by the desire to live authentically. But it was their future, and that, in itself, was a triumph. For Harry and Meghan, the altercation was a painful chapter in their journey, but it was also the beginning of a new one, a chapter that would be defined not by their past mistakes or the media's portrayal of them, but by their own choices, their own resilience, and their determination to move forward together. The fallout from the violent altercation between Harry and Meghan reverberated far beyond the confines of their home in Montecito. What began as a deeply personal crisis soon became an event of monumental consequence, not only for their relationship, but for the future of the British royal family and the public's perception of the Sussexes. The fallout was messy, layered with complexities, raw emotions, and reflections that would take years to fully process. For Harry, the fallout was particularly acute. He had spent much of his adult life trying to forge his own path, distancing himself from the traditional royal mold that his older brother, William, embodied so perfectly. But after the altercation, Harry realized the painful truth. No matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape the shackles of the monarchy, his identity was forever tied to it. The press, the public, even the royal family itself. Harry could no longer pretend that these forces did not shape his existence. The altercation had exposed the fracture in his relationship with William, a fracture that had been festering for years but was now brought to the surface with devastating clarity. The tears William had shed on live television, so raw and heartbreaking, had forced Harry to confront the reality of their brotherhood. Their bond, once inseparable, had now been fractured by resentment, misunderstandings, and deep-seated pain. For Harry, the aftermath of the altercation was a painful realization that the distance between him and his family was not something that could be healed with a single conversation or a heartfelt apology. It was something deeper, something rooted in years of emotional baggage that neither he nor William had ever fully addressed. As Harry began to reflect on his actions, he felt a growing sense of guilt. Had he pushed his family too far? Had his decision to leave the royal family, to reject the very institution that had shaped him, been the right one? He had always believed that his actions were justified, that he was fighting for his own happiness and the well-being of his family. But in the aftermath of the altercation, Harry began to question whether he had truly understood the consequences of his decisions. For Meghan, the fallout was equally complex. She had long been the target of media criticism, but the altercation had placed her at the center of a media storm that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. In the wake of the event, the press had seized upon her as the villain, painting her as the cause of the conflict, the one responsible for the breakdown of their marriage. The media's portrayal of her was brutal. Some outlets labeled her manipulative, while others insinuated that she was emotionally abusive. For Meghan, this was a devastating blow. She had spent much of her life fighting against the stereotypes and expectations that had been placed on her, but now she found herself trapped in a narrative she could not control. Yet, even as she faced the harsh criticism, Meghan began to reflect on the choices she had made. She knew that the media would always paint her in a certain light. She had come to expect that. But what was more difficult to reconcile was the reality of her relationship with Harry. Had she pushed him too far? Had she asked too much of him? Meghan had always believed in the strength of their bond, in the power of their love. But now, in the wake of the altercation, she was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that their relationship had been strained for longer than she had realized. In private, Harry and Meghan began to talk more openly about their struggles, about the emotional toll of their choices and the pressures that had come with their public lives. They acknowledged the difficult truths they had both avoided, the unspoken frustrations, the mounting tensions, the sacrifices they had made for the sake of their family and their public image. They had always prided themselves on being a team, but now they saw just how much they had allowed external pressures to undermine their relationship. For both of them, the fallout was a painful but necessary process. The altercation had forced them to confront their own vulnerabilities, their own insecurities, and the reality of their situation. They had spent so much time fighting against the system, fighting against the expectations of the royal family and the media, but now they had to face the truth about their own lives. They could not escape the past. They had to own it, learn from it, and move forward with a new understanding of who they were and what they truly wanted. In the months that followed, both Harry and Meghan began to make changes in their lives. They focused on their family, on healing, and on redefining their public roles. They knew that the media would continue to scrutinize them, but they were determined to live life on their own terms. They made efforts to distance themselves from the media frenzy, turning down interviews and public appearances in favor of more personal, private moments. Their priority was their children, Archie and Lilibet, and they were committed to providing them with a stable, loving environment away from the prying eyes of the press. For Harry, the journey of reflection was also about reconciling his past with his present. He had spent years rebelling against the royal family, rejecting the life that had been laid out for him. But now, after the altercation, he realized that he could no longer ignore the legacy of his family. The royal family, with all its flaws and dysfunction, was a part of him. He had been raised within that system, shaped by its values and expectations. It was time for him to find a way to make peace with that, to acknowledge it without allowing it to define him. Meghan, too, began to reflect on her role in the story. She had long been an outsider in the royal family, and she had spent years fighting against the constraints that had been placed on her. But the altercation had forced her to confront the reality that her life, her choices, and her relationship with Harry were always going to be intertwined with the royal family. She could not erase that part of their story, no matter how hard she tried. But what she could do was redefine it. She could carve out a space for herself and Harry, a space where they could live authentically, on their own terms. In the end, the fallout from the altercation had been a wake-up call for both of them. It had forced them to confront their own flaws, their own mistakes, and the consequences of their actions. But it had also given them the opportunity to heal, to rebuild, and to grow stronger as individuals and as a couple. The journey ahead would not be easy, and the public would continue to watch their every move. But for Harry and Meghan, the most important thing was that they had each other, and they were determined to face whatever came next, together. The events of the past few months, Harry's altercation, the public fallout, William's emotional breakdown, had set in motion a chain of reactions that no one in the royal family could have predicted. While Harry and Meghan tried to move forward with their lives in Montecito, trying to heal from the wounds that had been laid bare for the world to see, the monarchy itself stood at a crossroads. The royal family, once seen as an unshakable institution, now faced an uncertain future. The divide between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family was no longer something that could be hidden behind palace walls. It was exposed for all to see, leaving a legacy of unresolved tensions, shifting loyalties, and unanswered questions. In the aftermath of the altercation, many began to question the future of the royal family itself. Would it survive the public scrutiny that had been thrust upon it? Could it maintain its relevance in a modern world where transparency and accountability were increasingly demanded? For decades, the monarchy had managed to weather scandal, tragedy, and public outcry, but this crisis felt different. The lines between personal and public lives had blurred beyond repair, and now, the royal family was forced to reckon with the consequences of their actions, or, more precisely, the consequences of their silence. For King Charles, this was a moment of reckoning. As the newly crowned monarch, he had inherited not just the throne, but the weight of a monarchy that had endured centuries of tradition. His reign had begun under the shadow of his mother's passing and the ongoing media scrutiny of his family, particularly the fractured relationship between Harry and the rest of the royals. Charles had always prided himself on being a man of duty, of service, but now, as king, he was faced with a challenge unlike any other. His son, Harry, had made it clear that he no longer wanted to be a part of the royal institution. But Charles had to find a way to navigate the complexities of his relationship with Harry, as well as the implications of Harry and Meghan's departure. How could the monarchy maintain its dignity when one of its most prominent members had chosen to step away? Charles, ever the pragmatic monarch, knew that the royal family's ability to survive this crisis depended on its ability to adapt. The monarchy could no longer operate as it had in the past, cloaked in secrecy and insulated from the demands of the public. The royal family had to modernize, to connect with the people in a way that felt more authentic. But this modernization had to come without losing the essence of what the monarchy stood for. The question of whether the monarchy could evolve without losing its historical gravitas was one that Charles would need to answer as he moved forward with his reign. But as King Charles struggled with these existential questions, he also had to contend with the fallout from his son's very public rift. Prince William, as the heir to the throne, was increasingly under pressure to manage the family's public image and its relations with Harry and Meghan. William had always been the more reserved of the two brothers, focused on his royal duties and the responsibilities that came with being the future king. But with Harry's departure and the altercation that had shattered their relationship, William found himself thrust into a leadership role that he had not anticipated. His emotional breakdown had already become a defining moment in his public life, one that signified the deep personal cost of his position. But beyond the tears and the rawness of the moment, William knew that the monarchy depended on him to hold it together. For William, the future of the royal family was no longer just about duty, it was about healing. It was about finding a way to reconcile the fractured bond with his brother, not just for their sake, but for the sake of the institution they represented. The rift between him and Harry had gone beyond personal grievances. It had become a symbol of the division within the royal family itself. William understood that his role as future king was not just about upholding royal traditions, but about mending the cracks that had formed within his own family. It was a daunting responsibility, and one that would define his reign as much as any royal duty or state visit ever would. But the path to healing was unclear. There was no roadmap for what came next, no precedent for a royal family that had publicly fractured in this way. William and Harry had always been close, but the events of the past few years had irreparably damaged their relationship. Despite the emotional weight of William's breakdown, Harry's injury, and the media's unrelenting coverage, there was no guarantee that the brothers would reconcile. In fact, the divide between them seemed to grow wider with every passing day. For Princess Catherine, William's wife, the situation was equally fraught. As the future queen consort, Catherine had long been seen as the embodiment of royal grace and duty. But now, she found herself navigating the complexities of royal family politics in ways she had never anticipated. Her support for William, her commitment to their family, and her understanding of the weight of the monarchy's demands were all tested in the wake of Harry and Meghan's departure. Catherine, like William, had to grapple with the reality of a family divided. A family that had once been united in purpose, but now seemed fractured by personal pain. Her role, as the future queen, would require her to remain steadfast, to offer a sense of stability to both the royal family and the public. But the pressure of the situation weighed heavily on her, as it did on her husband. For the royal family, the future now seemed uncertain. The once unshakable institution had been forced to confront its own vulnerabilities. The rift between Harry and the rest of the family, particularly William, had exposed a deep fracture within the monarchy. The world had watched as William, a man whose public life had been defined by duty and poise, crumbled under the emotional weight of his brother's departure. For the first time in decades, the monarchy appeared vulnerable, unable to maintain the image of unity and strength it had carefully crafted for centuries. But the royal family's future was not solely defined by its internal struggles. The monarchy's survival also depended on its relationship with the public. The British people, once the monarchy's most ardent supporters, had grown increasingly skeptical of the royal family's role in modern society. The media, which had once been the royal family's protector, had become its harshest critic. The public's patience was thinning, and the pressure on the monarchy to evolve was mounting. In many ways, Harry and Meghan's departure had been the tipping point. Their decision to step away from royal duties had rocked the institution to its core, forcing the monarchy to confront questions about its relevance in the 21st century. For years, the monarchy had clung to tradition, to the notion that it was above reproach, untouchable. But now, the monarchy was vulnerable, its future uncertain. The question that loomed over the royal family was no longer just about the Sussexes. It was about the monarchy's ability to adapt to the changing times. Would the royal family survive this crisis, or would it fall apart under the weight of its own dysfunction? Could the monarchy remain relevant in a world where transparency, accountability, and authenticity were becoming the new normal? For Charles, William, and the rest of the royal family, these were questions that would determine their legacy and the legacy of the monarchy itself. But perhaps, in the end, the true test of the royal family's future was not whether it could weather the storm of public opinion, but whether it could heal the wounds within its own ranks. Only time would tell if the rift between Harry and William could ever be repaired, and if the royal family could find a way to move forward, united and strong, or whether it would become a symbol of a bygone era. The story of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had always been framed as one of modern love, rebellion, and the struggle between personal freedom and royal duty. Yet, in the wake of Harry's violent altercation, the public breakdown of William, and the unprecedented exposure of the royal family's private life, it became increasingly clear that the legacy of the Sussexes was more complex than anyone had imagined. Their choices, their actions, and the fallout from those decisions were shaping a narrative that would linger in public memory for generations. But what exactly would be the legacy they left behind? How would history remember the Sussexes, and what impact would it have on the monarchy as a whole? When Harry and Meghan first announced their departure from royal duties, the world watched with fascination, judgment, and speculation. Supporters hailed them as pioneers, brave enough to prioritize mental health, personal happiness, and autonomy over tradition and expectation. Critics, on the other hand, branded them as selfish, disloyal, and reckless, accusing them of abandoning duty and undermining centuries of royal continuity. Yet, beneath the headlines and social media frenzy, a deeper story was unfolding, a story about family, pressure, trauma, and the personal cost of living a life in the public eye. Harry's altercation, the physical injuries, and the subsequent public exposure of the royal family's private grief highlighted the human vulnerabilities that often go unseen behind crowns, formal attire, and ceremonial pomp. The legacy of the Sussexes is inseparable from the choices that led to this crisis. Harry, once the bright, cheerful prince whose every move was scrutinized, became a figure caught between two worlds, the monarchy that shaped him and the modern life he sought to create beyond its boundaries. Meghan, the American actress who married into royalty, faced immense public pressure and relentless media scrutiny. Her actions, whether defending her family, managing public appearances, or confronting personal conflicts, became emblematic of a broader struggle between traditional institutions and modern individuality. Together, they represented a seismic shift in the expectations of royal life. They questioned the cost of duty and challenged the notion that personal happiness must always be secondary to public service. Yet, the violent altercation that left Harry injured added a dramatic and tragic dimension to their legacy. It was no longer simply a story of rebellion and independence. It had become one of physical consequences, emotional trauma, and public spectacle. The images of Harry bandaged and bruised, juxtaposed with William's emotional breakdown on live television, forced the world to confront the real, human stakes behind the headlines. These were not abstract concepts or distant stories. They were tangible, raw, and deeply affecting. And in this exposure, the Sussexes' legacy took on a dual nature, one that celebrated personal courage and one that revealed the fragility of human relationships under extreme pressure. Moreover, the legacy of the Sussexes would not be measured solely by their conflicts or controversies. It was also defined by their attempts to reshape the conversation around mental health, family dynamics, and public accountability. Harry's advocacy for veterans, his openness about mental health struggles, and Meghan's public initiatives for gender equality and social justice all contributed to a narrative that extended beyond palace walls. Even amid scandal and personal strife, they had leveraged their platform to address issues that resonated deeply with people worldwide. Their legacy, in this sense, was both disruptive and transformative. They forced the monarchy, and by extension, society, to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, responsibility, and the human cost of public scrutiny. The public's perception of the Sussexes played a crucial role in shaping their legacy. Some viewed them as heroes, courageously exposing the cracks within an institution that had long been shrouded in secrecy. Others saw them as instigators, bringing chaos and drama into a family that had worked tirelessly to maintain dignity and tradition. Social media amplified every moment, every word, and every image, creating a feedback loop that heightened both admiration and condemnation. This relentless visibility meant that the legacy of the Sussexes would be inseparable from the court of public opinion, where every action was dissected and every narrative contested. Within the royal family, the legacy of the Sussexes was equally contentious. For William and Charles, Harry and Meghan's actions were not merely personal. They were political, symbolic, and deeply consequential. The rift that had developed represented not only a fracture in personal relationships, but also a challenge to the stability and unity of the monarchy itself. Every public statement, every media appearance, and every legal action taken by the Sussexes reverberated through Buckingham Palace and beyond. The legacy they were building was one of influence, disruption, and irrevocable change, forcing the institution to confront its own limitations and failures. Yet, despite the controversy and conflict, there remained a fundamental human element at the heart of their legacy. The bond between Harry and William, though strained, was rooted in shared history, love, and familial connection. The pressures placed on Harry and Meghan, from media scrutiny to institutional expectations, were immense and relentless. Their choices, while often polarizing, reflected a deeply human struggle. The desire for autonomy, recognition, and the ability to define one's own path in a world that demands conformity. In this sense, their legacy is not just about scandal. It is about courage, resilience, and the pursuit of selfhood against overwhelming odds. Looking to the future, the legacy of the Sussexes will continue to evolve. Their influence on the monarchy, on public discourse, and on the perception of royalty in the modern age is undeniable. They have challenged long-standing traditions, raised awareness of mental health issues, and exposed the vulnerabilities that exist even within the most revered institutions. While their methods and decisions may remain divisive, the impact of their actions is indisputable. They have forever altered the way the world views the royal family, and their story will be studied, debated, and remembered for generations. Ultimately, the legacy of the Sussexes is a study in contrasts. It is at once a tale of privilege and responsibility, of love and conflict, of public spectacle and private pain. It embodies both the possibilities and the perils of living life under a microscope. Harry and Meghan have become symbols of both hope and caution, proof that even in the most protected institutions, human desires, struggles, and vulnerabilities cannot be contained. Their legacy is complex, layered, and undeniably human. As the world continues to watch, the influence of the Sussexes will ripple through the royal family, the media, and the public consciousness. Their story serves as a reminder that behind the crowns and ceremonies, there are people who live, suffer, and struggle just like anyone else. And in this reminder, their legacy is firmly established, a testament to the power of personal choice, the consequences of public scrutiny, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The day after the shocking images of Prince Harry in the hospital circulated worldwide, the internet erupted. News outlets ran wall-to-wall coverage, social media feeds flooded with speculation, and public conversations were dominated by a single question: what had really happened to Prince Harry? The violent altercation, once a private family crisis, had now become a global spectacle. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted answers. The event transcended borders, tapping into universal themes of family conflict, vulnerability, and the human cost of fame. How could a prince, raised in privilege and security, be subjected to such pain? And why had the world been kept in the dark until now? The first public reactions came from those closest to the palace. William's tearful appearance on live television stunned viewers, not simply because of his emotional breakdown, but because it revealed a raw, unfiltered human side rarely seen in royal circles. For decades, the monarchy had cultivated an image of stoicism, resilience, and unwavering composure. To see William openly grappling with grief and frustration created a ripple effect, prompting millions to reconsider the image of the royals as untouchable figures. His vulnerability made the situation relatable, even for those who had been critical of the Sussexes' choices. People empathized not just with Harry, but with William, caught between love for his brother and the responsibilities of his position. Across the globe, public reactions varied dramatically. In the United Kingdom, newspapers ran sensational headlines describing Harry as a victim and Meghan as the instigator, while others cautioned against assigning blame without knowing the full story. The British public, historically fascinated by royal drama, was split down the middle. Some expressed anger and disappointment, fearing that the monarchy's reputation was irreparably damaged. Others voiced concern for Harry's well-being, highlighting the intense pressures faced by members of the royal family and questioning the role of media scrutiny in exacerbating the situation. Calls for compassion and understanding proliferated as the nation wrestled with the tension between tradition and empathy. Social media amplified these reactions, creating a 24-hour feedback loop of opinions, videos, and memes. Every tweet, post, and comment became part of the larger narrative, shaping perceptions in real time. Viral threads dissected Harry's injuries, speculated on the circumstances of the altercation, and debated the responsibilities of both Harry and Meghan. Hashtags trended globally, from hashtag Pray for Harry to hashtag Sussex Scandal, reflecting a public consumed by curiosity, outrage, and concern. Influencers and commentators weighed in, each offering their interpretation, analysis, or emotional response. For many, the incident was more than royal gossip. It was a reflection of broader societal dynamics, including the pressures of fame, the consequences of family conflict, and the human need for empathy. International reactions added another layer of complexity. Across Europe, commentators framed the incident as emblematic of a changing monarchy, one increasingly unable to contain personal conflict behind palace walls. In the United States, the focus shifted toward Meghan, often portrayed as a controversial figure whose decisions had real-world consequences for those around her. News networks replayed footage of Harry in bandages, juxtaposing it with images of William's emotional response, emphasizing the stark contrast between public perception and private suffering. Analysts debated whether this episode signaled deeper dysfunction within the royal family or simply the inevitable outcome of intense public scrutiny combined with personal discord. Experts on family dynamics and trauma began weighing in, offering perspectives that transcended celebrity. Psychologists highlighted the challenges of navigating conflict under constant public observation, noting that physical altercations between partners or family members, while tragic, often stem from a combination of stress, emotional suppression, and external pressures. Some experts suggested that Harry's upbringing, marked by early exposure to tragedy and immense expectations, may have made him more vulnerable to intense emotional reactions. Others emphasize the importance of addressing domestic conflict through support, counseling, and open communication, particularly when public attention magnifies private struggles. These expert opinions offered context that extended beyond sensational headlines, encouraging the public to consider the human factors behind the spectacle. The royal family itself faced a delicate balancing act. Public statements were carefully crafted, emphasizing concern for Harry's recovery while attempting to maintain dignity and decorum. Palace insiders described tense meetings behind closed doors, with family members negotiating how to respond without inflaming media speculation. Legal advisors monitored social media and press coverage, preparing for potential fallout. At the same time, the family had to consider the impact on public opinion, which could influence both the monarchy's reputation and the broader perception of its ability to manage internal crises. The stakes were unprecedented, as private conflict collided with global visibility in a way that few institutions had ever experienced. Among the public, reactions were intensely personal. Stories emerged from individuals who identified with Harry's pain, whether through experiences of domestic conflict, sibling rivalry, or familial estrangement. Forums and social media groups became spaces for reflection, empathy, and debate, as people shared their own experiences alongside commentary on the royal drama. Some expressed shock at the physical nature of the altercation, others mourned the apparent breakdown of family bonds, and many questioned the role of the media in amplifying conflict. The incident, while sensational, also resonated deeply, highlighting universal themes of love, loyalty, and the struggle to balance personal relationships with societal expectations. In addition, the incident reignited discussions about mental health and support systems. Mental health advocates seized the moment to underscore the importance of resources for those experiencing domestic or familial conflict. Campaigns emerged online encouraging individuals to seek help, speak openly about trauma, and prioritize well-being over societal pressures. In a strange way, Harry's suffering became a catalyst for broader conversations about human vulnerability, demonstrating that even individuals in positions of privilege are not immune to pain, conflict, or emotional breakdowns. The media coverage itself became a reflection of the broader public psyche. While some outlets focused on sensationalist details, others sought to provide thoughtful analysis, interviewing experts, historians, and former royal aides. Documentaries, live panels, and special news segments dissected the altercation, contextualizing it within the historical pressures faced by royals. Commentators debated the ethical responsibility of the media, questioning whether constant coverage of private conflict did more harm than good. The event, while specific to Harry and Meghan, raised universal questions about privacy, accountability, and the consequences of relentless public attention. Public reactions also highlighted the evolving role of monarchy in the modern world. The incident underscored the tension between tradition and transparency, between institutional expectation and personal freedom. Royals are expected to embody dignity, composure, and stability, yet Harry's experience revealed the impossibility of maintaining these ideals under extreme personal and public pressures. Citizens, scholars, and commentators alike debated whether the monarchy could adapt to changing societal norms without losing its essence, and whether personal failings or conflicts should diminish the institution's relevance. Finally, the legacy of public reaction to Harry's altercation was intertwined with emotional resonance. Millions felt a sense of collective empathy, witnessing human vulnerability on an unprecedented scale. The images of Harry bandaged and injured, the raw display of William's grief, and the global discussion that followed created a shared emotional experience that transcended nationality, social class, and political affiliation. People reflected not only on the specifics of the event, but also on broader questions. How do we support those in crisis? How do we balance privacy with public interest? And what does this tell us about the nature of fame, duty, and family in the modern age? In the end, the public reactions were as much a part of the story as the altercation itself. They revealed the collective fascination with royalty, the deep empathy for human suffering, and the relentless scrutiny that comes with public life. Harry and Meghan's personal conflict, once private, became a mirror for societal values, anxieties, and aspirations. Their story illuminated the fragility of human relationships under pressure, the complexities of love and loyalty, and the enduring power of family bonds, even when strained to the breaking point. The narrative of the Sussexes and the public's response to it would continue to shape perceptions of the monarchy, influencing discourse, empathy, and understanding for years to come. As the dust settled from the shocking images of Prince Harry injured and William's emotional breakdown, the world began to reflect not just on the incident itself, but on the larger implications it held for the royal family, the public, and society at large. The physical altercation between Harry and Meghan, which had left Harry with serious facial and head injuries, served as a stark reminder that even those born into privilege are not immune to personal turmoil. Beneath the polished veneer of royal life lay complex human emotions: anger, frustration, fear, and love, manifested in ways that could shock, bewilder, and deeply move the public. The first lesson many drew was about the consequences of unresolved conflict. Families, no matter how prestigious or public, carry tensions, misunderstandings, and long-held grievances. When these conflicts are compounded by intense media scrutiny and the pressures of public expectation, even a minor disagreement can escalate into something catastrophic. Harry and Meghan's fight, though extraordinary in its visibility and outcome, mirrored struggles that countless families face in private. It reminded the public that human relationships, even in the most powerful households, require attention, empathy, and communication to navigate safely. Another significant takeaway was the importance of emotional transparency and vulnerability. William's tearful live television appearance, breaking decades of royal stoicism, became a defining moment not only for the monarchy, but for public discourse on mental health. Millions of viewers were struck by the sight of a prince openly expressing grief and concern, demonstrating that strength does not always mean suppressing emotion. His reaction resonated globally, prompting conversations about how men, particularly those in positions of authority, are often socialized to hide vulnerability. William's public display encouraged a more compassionate understanding of human emotion, showing that even figures of immense power experience pain and need support. The incident also highlighted the critical role of accountability in relationships. While the details of what led to the altercation remain closely guarded by the individuals involved, the event sparked discussions on responsibility, boundaries, and the importance of addressing conflicts constructively. Experts emphasize that physical altercations, regardless of context, signify a breakdown in communication and a failure to manage stress and emotions effectively. For public figures, the stakes are magnified. Every decision, action, and interaction is scrutinized, making accountability not just a personal obligation, but a public one. This episode served as a cautionary tale about the repercussions of letting conflicts escalate unchecked. Public reaction further underscored society's fascination with both tragedy and triumph in high-profile lives. Millions of people followed the story closely, debating, sympathizing, and reflecting on the complexities of fame, duty, and family. The world's response revealed a deep hunger for understanding human behavior beyond surface appearances. Audiences were not just interested in scandal or gossip. They were drawn to the emotional truths behind the headlines. The pain of fractured relationships, the challenges of balancing personal and public life, and the resilience required to navigate extraordinary circumstances. The story of Harry and William became, for many, a mirror reflecting universal human experiences, amplified by the extraordinary circumstances of royalty. The incident also reignited conversations about media responsibility. In an era where news cycles are instantaneous and social media amplifies every moment, the coverage of Harry's injuries and William's emotional response demonstrated both the power and the dangers of constant public scrutiny. Experts, journalists, and media analysts debated whether the intensity of coverage exacerbated the situation, placing additional strain on individuals already dealing with emotional and physical trauma. The event sparked reflection on the ethical responsibilities of reporters and content creators, highlighting the delicate balance between public interest and personal privacy, especially when dealing with vulnerable individuals. Furthermore, The altercation and its aftermath brought attention to the evolving role of monarchy in the modern world. The incident highlighted the tension between traditional expectations and contemporary values. Royals are expected to embody composure, stability, and moral leadership. Yet Harry and William's experience revealed that human vulnerability is unavoidable, even in the most highly scrutinized lives. The public's empathetic response suggested that audiences may be ready to see royals as multidimensional individuals, capable of struggle, growth, and emotional complexity. This shift in perception could influence the future of the monarchy, encouraging greater openness, transparency, and adaptability in response to societal expectations. Another crucial reflection involved the impact of trauma on familial relationships. Harry's injuries, both physical and emotional, underscored the long-term effects that unresolved tensions can have on personal well-being. Psychologists noted that trauma within families, especially when compounded by public scrutiny, can create cycles of stress, resentment, and behavioral challenges. The global conversation prompted by this incident emphasized the need for proactive mental health support, counseling, and mechanisms to address conflict before it escalates. It served as a reminder that care, attention, and intervention are vital to maintaining both individual health and the integrity of relationships. Finally, the story prompted a broader meditation on empathy, compassion, and collective responsibility. Audiences were challenged to consider the human cost behind headlines and sensationalized narratives. The images of Harry in the hospital, William in tears, and the complex web of public, private, and media reactions invited reflection on how society engages with stories of personal struggle. The narrative encouraged viewers to approach conflict with a deeper understanding of context, to prioritize human well-being over judgment, and to recognize that even those living extraordinary lives face challenges that are profoundly relatable. In conclusion, the violent altercation between Harry and Meghan, Harry's injuries, and William's public breakdown served as more than a sensational news story. It became a case study in human emotion, resilience, and the consequences of conflict under extraordinary circumstances. It prompted global reflection on family dynamics, accountability, media ethics, mental health, and the evolving perception of royalty. Most importantly, it revealed the enduring power of empathy, how shared human experiences, even among the most privileged and scrutinized, can unite people in understanding, concern, and reflection. The story left the world not only shocked but profoundly moved, reminding everyone that beneath public titles, headlines, and appearances, the complexities of human relationships remain universal and deeply compelling. As viewers pondered the images, narratives, and reactions, one thought lingered. Regardless of status, wealth, or public scrutiny, the human heart is fragile, relationships are complicated, and the need for understanding, communication, and compassion is universal. What the world witnessed was not just a royal incident. It was a mirror reflecting the emotional truths of humanity itself. It was a reminder that even amidst grandeur, privilege, and global attention, the most important battles are often fought within, and the lessons learned can resonate far beyond palace walls. This was a moment that would be discussed for years to come, a turning point in how the world perceives the Sussexes, the monarchy, and the human capacity for vulnerability, empathy, and resilience. The events left an indelible mark, a story that transcended royal drama to touch on timeless truths about family, duty, and the unyielding strength required to navigate the most personal of storms under the relentless gaze of the world. The tale of Harry's injuries and William's breakdown, therefore, becomes a story not just of scandal or shock, but of reflection, learning, and the enduring human need for connection and understanding. It is a narrative that calls for compassion, invites dialogue, and leaves the audience with a profound recognition of the emotional depth and complexity.